In 1759, Martha Dandridge Custis, one of the wealthiest young widows in Virginia, married Colonel George Washington. History remembers Martha as the First Lady, refined, dignified, a symbol of early American womanhood. What history often forgets is that at the time of their marriage, George Washington owned around 18 human beings, but Martha owned 84 enslaved Africans herself. Her fortune of 17,500 acres of land and a captive labor force of men, women, and children made her far richer than her husband. As mistress of her plantations, she approved the work conditions, sanctioned punishments, and decided which families could stay together or be torn apart. Her approval was the quiet power behind every order carried out in her name. And she kept control of her slaves even after marrying George, managing them separately. This was common practice among elite Southern women. Even the so-called founding mothers preserved their wealth and comfort through systems of cruelty they endorsed and sustained. George Washington Parke Custis, George Washington's adopted son, once recounted that as a boy, he was 10 times more afraid of George's mother, Mary Ball Washington, than of his own father. Why? Because she was formidable and unapologetically authoritative over the people she enslaved. A woman who commanded fear and obedience in equal measure, yet in her upbringing and lifestyle, Mary Ball Washington was hardly unique. The reality is that white women's identities in slaveholding America were entwined with slavery from earliest youth. We often hear how white women in early America couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and legally lost their property when they married. All that is true, but there was one kind of property they almost always controlled: enslaved people. For generations, the image of the Southern belle, the gentle white mistress of the plantation, has drifted through American memory wrapped in romance. We picture silk dresses and polite smiles, a gracious lady offering sweet tea on the veranda while contented servants bustle about. It's a comforting image that casts white women as the softer, gentler side of an otherwise brutal system. But this image is a lie. Behind the facade of femininity and supposed delicacy, many white women in America were active and willing participants in slavery's horrors. Their role has been largely hidden, downplayed by 19th century propaganda and even by later historians. Yet the truth unearthed through the voices of enslaved people and fresh historical research is undeniable and chilling. White women were not innocent bystanders to the slave trade. They were enslavers themselves, often just as complicit and cruel as white men, if not even more so. This is the story of those women, and it is a story that must be told with a sense of justice for the enslaved people who suffered brutal conditions under the authority of white mistresses. If you're ready to step into the shadows of America's forgotten sins, then stay with us in this video. And before we start, we encourage you to subscribe. Every story in this channel drags truth back from the dark where they left it. Now let's begin. The breadth of white women's direct involvement in slavery was far greater than many today realize. It was not just a handful of rich widows managing plantations. By the eve of the Civil War, white women made up roughly 40% of all slaveholders in the South. That would mean that nearly 2 out of every 5 slaveholders were female. Census records from 1850 and 1860 show thousands of women, married, single, or widowed, listed as the owners of enslaved people. They range from grand plantation mistresses to small farm wives who might only own 1 or 2 individuals. Historically, attention focused on white men and their large slave counts, which obscured the ubiquity of women slave owners. But the evidence is clear. When we picture a slave auction in the 1800s, we should picture women present as buyers and sellers, not just men. When we imagine a plantation, we must see the lady of the house not as a powerless accessory, but often as the de facto manager in her husband's absence and a co-owner of the human property. Indeed, the very term mistress in the context of slavery did not mean a demure counterpart to the master. It meant a female sovereign of the household domain. Enslaved people, including grown men, were expected to address even a teenage white girl as mistress and submit to her orders. Within the boundaries of plantation life, the mistress wielded tremendous power, and unlike the master, she lived among the enslaved all day long, monitoring and directing their labor in intimate proximity. She knew their names, their habits, their weaknesses, and she had the authority to punish them on the spot. For many enslaved people, especially women and children, the antebellum household was where the sharpest pains were inflicted, often by the hand of the mistress. In Louisiana in the 1840s, an enslaved young woman named Patsy was living a nightmare. Patsy's enslaver was Edwin Epps, a notoriously cruel plantation owner. But the person Patsy feared even more than Epps was Epps's wife, Mistress Mary Epps. Solomon Northup, a free black man who had been kidnapped and enslaved on the Epps farm and later wrote his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, witnessed the torture Patsy endured. Patsy was invaluable to Master Epps for her prodigious skill picking cotton and tragically for her beauty. Epps repeatedly raped her. This infuriated Mary Epps, the mistress of the house. Northup described how Patsy's back bore the scars of 1,000 lashes, not because she was backward in her work, nor because she was of a rebellious spirit, but because it had fallen to her lot to be the slave of a degenerate master and a jealous mistress. Caught between the lust of the white man and the wrath of the white woman, Patsy often suffered more and wept more than any of her companions. According to Northup, nothing delighted the mistress so much as to see Patsy suffer. Mary Epps would fly into rages and demand that Patsy be punished for the slightest reason or even for no reason at all. On more than one occasion, when her husband refused to sell Patsy, Mistress Epps secretly tried to bribe Solomon Northup to kill Patsy and dispose of her body in the swamp. She was so consumed by hatred and jealousy that she literally conspired to murder her husband's victim. Northup, horrified, of course, did not carry out this evil request, but Patsy remained trapped. One day, after a particularly vicious incident, Epps himself, goaded by his wife's rage, tied Patsy to a post and savagely whipped her until she was near death. Mistress Epps stood by, watching with satisfaction as each raw stripe was inflicted on the girl's body. In Northup's account, Patsy was said to have had no comfort of her life. If the master's lust didn't violate her, the mistress's malice would find another way to hurt her. Patsy's story is just one of the many examples of a cruel reality long suppressed. Many white women slaveholders were brutally violent. The common stereotype has been that enslaved people feared the master's whip, while the mistress offered a modicum of gentleness or was perhaps a moderating influence. The truth was often the opposite. Enslaved memoirs and interviews are filled with memories of cruel mistresses. In Harriet Jacobs's autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she recounts her own experience as a teenage slave facing sexual abuse from her master. The master's wife knew of his predatory behavior. Jacobs had naively hoped the wife might protect her. After all, wasn't she a woman too, with a woman's empathy? But Jacobs discovered otherwise. The mistress, who ought to protect the helpless victim, has no other feelings towards her but those of jealousy and rage, Jacobs wrote bitterly. The white mistress directed all her anger at the enslaved girl, seeing her not as a victim of the master's abuse, but as a rival or an object of scorn. Mrs. Flint tormented the young woman psychologically, monitoring her, sending her spiteful messages, and even forcing Jacobs to sleep in the mistress's room to keep an eye on her. An ordeal Jacobs described as degrading and terrifying. The mistress never confronted her husband to stop his abusive behavior. Instead, she made Jacobs' life a misery. Jacobs goes on to recount how Southern slaveholding women often accepted their husband's siring of children with enslaved women and then took out their humiliation on those enslaved mothers and children. Many a Southern wife, Jacobs notes, would promptly insist that her husband sell off his mixed-race offspring, her stepchildren, as soon as they were born, treating those babies as disgusting reminders to be rid of for cash. But violence by mistresses was not limited to sexual jealousy. Often it was driven by sheer dominance and cruelty. We have accounts of mistresses who personally whipped slaves for minor infractions like a spot on a tablecloth or a perceived tone of insolence. Unlike masters, whose violence might explode in drunken rages or calculated terror, mistresses often employed a steady, daily cruelty. The constant pinpricks and slaps, the demeaning insults, and yes, the lashes too. Former slaves recalled being punched, scratched, or hit with household objects by enraged mistresses. A slave named William Wells Brown remembered how the mistress of his Missouri household would burn the hands of an enslaved child who stole a lump of sugar, or how she once broke a heavy stick over a housemaid's head. These cruelties were part of the normalized culture of slavery. In a slave society, white women were taught that disciplining slaves was their prerogative and even their duty. Some took a sadistic pleasure in it, while others perhaps felt it was simply necessary to maintain order. Either way, the pain inflicted was real. One of the most infamous cases on record is that of Madame Delphine LaLaurie of New Orleans. LaLaurie was a wealthy socialite, known outwardly for throwing lavish parties in the early 1830s. Behind closed doors, she was a nightmare of a mistress. Neighbors found out she was mistreating her slaves after a few disturbing incidents. In one, she chased a 12-year-old enslaved girl with a whip until the child fell off the roof to her death. But because authorities in that era rarely intervened in how an owner treated enslaved people, LaLaurie's abuses went largely unchecked. The full extent of her cruelty only came to light in April 1834, when a fire broke out in her mansion. As people rushed to help, they discovered a torture chamber in the attic. At least 7 enslaved individuals were found starved, chained, and horribly mutilated. The 70-year-old black woman who had been chained in the kitchen and started the fire in an attempt to take her own life to escape the torture led rescuers to this ghastly scene. The city of New Orleans was shocked. A mob of outraged townspeople, even in a society accustomed to the cruelties of slavery, formed and ransacked the LaLaurie house, furious at the sadism that exceeded even their stomach for violence. Madame LaLaurie fled the city in the night, reportedly escaping to France, and was never held legally accountable. Her name, however, became synonymous with monstrous cruelty. LaLaurie was an extreme case, but she was a woman. Her gender did not make her inherently more humane. She simply had fewer social constraints on her brutality than other mistresses who might have feared scandal. But behind many a refined Southern lady's smile was a capacity for brutality and cruelty when it came to the black lives she controlled. A formerly enslaved man named Henry Bibb recounted how his mistress once sold his beloved child away from him as revenge after Henry repeatedly tried to escape. The mistress declared that if he hated her so much as to run, she'd remove the joy of his life. The pain of that loss, inflicted by a white woman who knew exactly what she was doing, never left him. Enslaved people often remarked that the mistress could be even more dreaded than the master. Historical records show many instances where husbands actually restrained their wives' harsher impulses. There were plantation owners who stopped a punishment ordered by the mistress, or who quietly sold a slave to prevent the mistress from inflicting further harm out of personal spite. But this wasn't out of kindness on the husband's part. Often it was to protect their investment from being destroyed by a wife's rage. By the mid-1800s, the archetype of the jealous mistress had even entered popular culture, recognized in literature and slave folk tales alike. But Southern apologists often twisted this image to gain sympathy for white women, painting them as pitiable wives driven crazy by their husbands' misdeeds. What that narrative conveniently left out was the suffering of the enslaved victims of these women. The focus was on the poor white woman's wounded honor, not on the black girl whose back was bleeding. In reality, whatever personal anguish white women felt in the slave South, most chose to uphold and enforce the very system that caused their anguish. They directed their anger downward to those even more powerless, rather than challenge the patriarchy that limited them or the husbands who betrayed them. Now we have seen the power and cruelty wielded by these women in their homes, but their role was not confined to the domestic sphere. White women were also active in the business of slavery, the buying, selling, and profit-making that sustained the whole system. Indeed, plantation mistresses were not only enforcers of slavery's violence, they were entrepreneurs of slavery's economy. The image of slave trading, the auction block, the trader's pen, usually conjures up men in suits and top hats, making deals over human chattel. But evidence reveals that white women were deeply involved in the slave market, often just as much as men. There were white women who attended slave auctions in person, though some considered it unbecoming of a lady to be seen at the market. So instead of going to public auctions, many mistresses had a workaround. The slave market came to them. They would send agents or invite trusted slave traders to their home. In her parlor, over tea, a lady might inspect an enslaved girl's teeth or quiz an enslaved man about his skills, just as any buyer would, before finalizing a purchase. Stephanie Jones Rogers unearthed records showing that in 18th century South Carolina, around 40% of bills of sale for enslaved people listed a woman as either buyer or seller. In other words, women were everywhere in these transactions. They sold slaves to raise cash, and they bought slaves to expand their holdings or to meet specific labor needs. Because married women legally had constraints due to laws of coverture that gave husbands control of wives' property, one might think they had little direct say in slave trading. But Southern white women found ways to assert economic independence despite those laws. Wealthy families often arranged marriage contracts or trusts to ensure a bride continued to control the slaves she brought into the marriage. These were like early prenuptial agreements focusing specifically on human property. If a husband tried to sell off his wife's slaves without her permission, she might take him to court. In fact, Jones Rogers documents cases of Southern women going to court to defend their property rights in enslaved people during divorces or estate disputes. They won many of those cases. Southern judges frequently honored a woman's claim to slaves that were part of her inheritance or dowry. So even within a patriarchal legal system, white women carved out space to be recognized as slave owners in their own right. Young white girls learned to appraise enslaved people's value early on. There are accounts of little girls in slave-holding families being taken along to the market by their fathers, both as a thrill and an educational experience. A 9-year-old girl might watch a man being auctioned and see her father bidding, absorbing that this is part of her world. Some sources even mention plays where children would mimic auctions, with the white children pretending to sell their black playmates, a grotesque game that unfortunately mirrored reality. By the time those girls grew up, they were thoroughly acquainted with the concept that human beings could be assets to acquire or liquidate. The economic savvy of white women slaveholders manifested in many ways. For instance, during the peak of the cotton boom, a resourceful mistress might urge her husband to invest in more field hands to plant more acres, essentially acting as a partner in financial planning. If the price of cotton dropped, she might suggest selling a couple of surplus house slaves to cut losses. White women also engaged in slave-based entrepreneurial schemes. One particularly cruel enterprise that many white women oversaw was the practice of enslaved wet nursing. In the 19th century, it was fashionable and even seen as healthy for upper-class white mothers not to nurse their own babies, but to hire a wet nurse. Enslaved women who had recently given birth were the ideal candidates. They had milk, and of course, they could not negotiate pay or refuse. Southern newspapers were filled with advertisements like "Wanted, a young Negro woman with baby as wet nurse for an infant, apply at such and such address." Who placed these ads? Often it was white women, the mothers or mothers-to-be, essentially creating a market for black women's breast milk. The cruelty here had layers. First, the enslaved mother's own baby would typically be taken away or neglected so that the mistress's baby could drink the milk. Enslaved mothers were forced to wean their infants early, or their babies were fed rag water so that the mistress's child could physically consume the nourishment meant for the black child. Second, some mistresses orchestrated pregnancies among their slaves to ensure a steady supply of wet nurses. According to Jones Rogers' research, white women slave owners sometimes planned instances of sexual violence, effectively compelling an enslaved man and woman to conceive a child so that more slave babies, and thus lactating mothers, would be available. These women wanted wet nurses on hand, and they treated black fertility as a tool to serve their own households. Imagine the mindset it takes to think this way. A white woman, pregnant with her own child, looks at the enslaved women she owns and plots which of them should get pregnant so that in 9 months she'll have someone to feed her baby. It is a horrific inversion of motherhood, turning the sacred act of nursing into yet another exploitation. Economically, the wet nurse system benefited white women in multiple ways. It freed them from nursing, allowing them to recover faster, get pregnant again sooner if they wished, and attend social functions unencumbered by infants. It also, in their minds, kept their bodies more youthful by avoiding breastfeeding. And if they arranged it cleverly, they could even make money. Some mistresses would rent out their enslaved wet nurses, to other families for a fee during the period they were nursing. Enslaved women's bodies and bodily functions were thus monetized in a truly dehumanizing way, and it was white women who drove this particular commerce. The economic stake white women had in slavery also meant they were among its staunchest defenders. They were keenly aware that their fortunes and futures depended on it. They knew that without slaves, they would lose their labor force and much of their wealth. Many had no training to do productive work themselves. Their entire lives were built around the expectation that black hands would do the manual labor and even much of the child care. So, white women had concrete reasons to perpetuate slavery beyond abstract racial prejudice, though they had plenty of that too. It was personal finance and comfort on the line. With this in mind, we now transition to the period when that entire economy came under threat, the years of growing abolitionist clamor, secession, and civil war. How would these white women, so deeply invested in slavery, react when the foundation of their world was challenged? In the 1850s, as America careened toward conflict over slavery, Southern white women stood as some of the institution's most ardent and vocal supporters. They had to be. Their entire way of life was at stake. So, when Southern politicians cried that abolition would bring ruin and chaos, plantation mistresses nodded in vigorous agreement. They were afraid, and their fear often manifested as hardened resolve to resist any change. Some of the political fire eaters of the South openly called on ladies to use their influence to spur the men to action. Many women took up the charge with enthusiasm. They formed aid societies to support pro-slavery causes, sewed flags and shirts for Confederate troops, and sometimes even wrote pamphlets or newspaper articles extolling slavery as a positive good. A famous example is Caroline Lee Hentz, a Southern white woman who penned a novel called The Planter's Northern Bride as a rebuttal to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. In it, she painted an idyllic picture of plantation life and virtuous Southern mistresses caring for grateful slaves, trying to counter Stowe's damning portrayal of slavery's brutality. That Hentz felt compelled to write it illustrates how white women participated in the ideological defense of slavery. They wielded the pen to assure readers that slavery was righteous and that slave owners, especially female ones, were kind guardians, not villains. Of course, this was propaganda and wishful thinking. By this point, abolitionist writings and slave narratives had widely exposed the cruel reality, including the role of cruel mistresses. But pro-slavery women were undeterred in propagating the lie of the benign mistress. Their social standing and moral self-image depended on it. When Civil War finally erupted in 1861, Southern white women demonstrated both fury and tenacity in service of the Confederate cause. They organized lady soldiers' aid societies to supply troops, yes, but they also acted on the home front to keep slavery intact as long as possible. As Union armies penetrated the South, enslaved people by the tens of thousands fled to Union lines or otherwise grasped freedom. Many white men were off fighting, so it often fell to the mistress at home to decide how to respond. Some begged their slaves to stay, making vague promises of better treatment or even future freedom if they would just not run. Others chose coercion. There are accounts of white women literally chasing fleeing slaves with guns or whipping those who talked of escape. One extraordinary case is that of Martha Gibbs, a plantation mistress from Mississippi. As Union forces neared, Martha Gibbs force-marched a group of the people she enslaved over 400 miles west into Texas, which was still firmly under Confederate control and more isolated, rather than risk losing them. She drove them harshly, armed with a pistol, and once in Texas, she continued to force them to work on a rented farm. The war ended, but Martha Gibbs didn't end slavery on her little outpost. Months after the Confederacy had collapsed, she held her enslaved laborers essentially captive, threatening to shoot anyone who tried to leave. She kept them in servitude until 1866, when finally Union officials compelled her to release them. Imagine the stubbornness and fanaticism required. Slavery was dead by law, the South defeated, yet here was a lone woman with a gun insisting to black men and women that she was still their master. Martha Gibbs's story might sound extreme, but it reveals a broader phenomenon, a great many white women did everything they could to stave off emancipation. When President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863, it technically freed slaves in rebel-held territories, though actual enforcement depended on Union military advances. Enslaved people in remote plantations often didn't know about it unless someone told them or Union troops arrived. Many mistresses who heard rumors of the proclamation kept it secret from their slaves. Even later, when the Confederacy fell in 1865, some plantation mistresses told their slaves that the Yankees were lying and that slavery was still in effect, hoping to squeeze a few more weeks or months of labor out of them. In Texas, famously, many enslaved people did not learn they were free until June 19, 1865. Juneteenth, now celebrated as the day freedom arrived, because owners deliberately delayed the announcement. We can be sure numerous white women were among those who delayed, clinging to the last shreds of power over those who had been their property. By April 1865, the Confederacy collapsed and the enslaved were legally emancipated. But the story doesn't end there, not for white women slaveholders. Reconstruction presented a new challenge. They had lost their human property, but not necessarily their attitudes or their desire to maintain dominance. Many former mistresses were impoverished by the war. One might think in their hardship, some would feel remorse, or at least realize the cost of the old system. Instead, most shifted into a mode of preserving as much of the old order as they could. They still held social clout in Southern society, and they used it to influence the new labor systems that replaced slavery. White women were at the forefront of pushing the narrative that the emancipated black people should continue working for white landowners under strict controls. They helped craft the idea of the benign sharecropper, or the loyal Negro servant who stays on for low wages. In many households, the mistress now called herself an employer, and the black woman who had been her slave was now a servant. But often, the conditions were slavery by another name. Wages, if paid, were pitiful. Abuse did not necessarily stop. There was no true equality in the relationship. Any black person who tried to assert their rights could be thrown out, or worse, accused of some offense and jailed. The start of the notorious convict labor system. White women participated actively in these injustices. For example, if a black nurse or maid was impertinent, a former mistress might get the local sheriff to arrest the maid on trumped-up charges. Then, that maid might find herself leased to a farm or chain gang. Slavery all over again, backed now by the state. Former slave owners of both genders found creative ways to subjugate black people after slavery, and white women were absolutely complicit in this process. While Reconstruction governments attempted to bring some justice and protect freed people's rights, most of those gains eroded after 1877, when so-called Redeemer governments regained power, ushering in the Jim Crow era. White women were heavily involved in groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The UDC's mission was to honor Confederate soldiers and promote a pro-Southern interpretation of history. They got busy erecting monuments to generals and also influencing school curricula. These women reviewed textbooks and pressured school boards to reject any that painted the Confederacy or slavery negatively. They insisted on textbooks that referred to masters as benevolent and often omitted mention of mistresses entirely, except perhaps to praise their loyalty to the South. In this way, the truth about slaveholding women remained largely hidden from subsequent generations. One stark example of the success of this narrative is Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind. While fiction, Mitchell's novel reflects what many white Southerners believed about the Old South. The protagonist, Scarlett O'Hara, is a young mistress of a plantation. She is depicted as tough and pragmatic, but also as caring in her own way for the black servants, referred to in the book with the term house servants, who supposedly love the family. The horrors of slavery are almost entirely left out of the story. There is a black woman character, Mammy, who is devoted to Scarlett's family, providing a comforting image of a loyal slave. Gone with the Wind was wildly popular, and its 1939 film adaptation became an American cultural phenomenon. For decades, this was how tens of millions visualized the Civil War South. Gallant men and gracious ladies with loyal slaves living contentedly among them. Everyone devastated when war upends their idyllic world. It's a narrative that focuses on the suffering of white women like Scarlett, who loses her status and struggles heroically to rebuild her life, rather than the suffering of the enslaved. And it was white women writers and memorialists who did much to propagate that narrative. They essentially wrote themselves a pardon in the court of public opinion, portraying themselves not as perpetrators of cruelty, but as dignified victims of historical upheaval. We have to ask, how did so much of this go unquestioned for so long? One reason is that after the war, the voices of the enslaved themselves were largely marginalized. Many former slaves died without ever having their stories widely heard beyond their communities. It wasn't until the 1930s, when the WPA slave narratives were collected, that a larger body of testimony about cruel mistresses and masters was documented. But even then, those interviews languished in archives for years. Mainstream historians, many of them white and male, often repeated the old tropes, or at least didn't highlight women's culpability. The field of women's history that emerged in the mid-20th century tended to emphasize women's oppression, which is valid in context of patriarchy, but sometimes lost sight of how those same women could be oppressors of others. The idea of sisterhood in feminist narratives clashed with the ugly fact that white women had brutally subjugated black women. So for a long time, the historical profession somewhat tiptoed around that fact. However, truth has a way of reasserting itself. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, black scholars and a new generation of historians began interrogating these myths. Works like The Volia Glimpse, Out of the House of Bondage, confronted the plantation mistresses were gentle ladies, fallacy head-on, documenting case after case of white women's violence. And Stephanie Jones Rogers' research, using those slave narratives and meticulous analysis of economic records, finally quantified and substantiated just how actively white women engaged in the slave economy. The legacy of these slaveholding women is thus a complicated and dark one. They were mothers and wives who passed on their racial prejudices to their children, helping to create a culture of white superiority that outlived slavery itself. With this, the hidden role of white women in the slave trade is hidden no longer. We have journeyed through the parlor and the marketplace, the whipping post and the auction block, guided by testimonies from those who lived it. And what we've uncovered is both illuminating and infuriating. White women were not the peripheral, helpless figures of so many old tales about slavery. They were central actors, and many were perpetrators of enormous harm. They bought and sold black people. They lashed backs and tore apart families. They fought tooth and nail to preserve their right to do so. And later, they lied about it to generations of Americans. It is a history that rightly makes us angry. Angry at the white women who betrayed any notion of sisterhood or decency in favor of racial dominance. Angry at a society that excused them for so long, buying into myths of the gentle lady while the cries of her victims went unheard. But along with anger, we feel a profound sympathy and mourning for the enslaved black individuals who suffered under these women. Their pain was compounded by the world's subsequent forgetfulness. We owe it to them to remember and to rage at what was done to them. Their mistresses wanted their stories buried, but today the truth is here, unveiled. With this revelation comes a more honest, if painful, understanding of our past. Only with such honesty can real healing and change begin. If this story stirred something in you, anger, grief, or truth, then don't just look away. Like this video so more people can find it, share it so the forgotten can finally be heard, and subscribe to our channel. Because here, we bring light to the parts of history that they tried to erase. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.